Dating's good.
Yeah, dating's good.
Dating's good. It's So I don't know if you've been following Melbourne, but we're in curfew here. We have been
Curfew.
for the last 4 weeks. Yeah, so we can leave the house between 5 a.m. and 8 p.m. and go no more than 5 kilometers away for 1 hour a day, one person shopping at a time.
Good heavens. For how long?
1 hour.
Now,
Yeah,
how long have you been on curfew?
4 weeks.
Hmm.
2 more
That's
left.
interesting.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Bring up dating, and I think, well, what you see behind me, that's been date space for basically the whole year. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I mean, yeah, it's there's something about um especially when taking all that we could talk about together and then condensing that into an hour from a place where it's like, oh yeah, I'm actually under curfew right now. I mean, I'm going to be here the whole time, basically just doing this. But to condense and sort of pull through, that right place of, well, it's something like, well, what is it when two minds come together to do something of value? This seems to be core.
Well, what I see is I see my daughter playing with that. Are we recording? Yeah, we are. Good. I see my daughter playing with that toy that many kids have, which has blocks of different shapes and holes of different shapes. And of course, the task is to figure out how to fit the right block in the right shaped hole. And I actually am now seeing even the specific, how do you call it, development of capacity or development of skillfulness, where she can pick up the block, she can look at it, she can rotate it, grasp which one it is, map it to something in her that tells her what hole it goes into, and then put it in the hole, like no experiments at all. And that's actually, I think, a really good metaphor. Now we've got some number of blocks that we're dealing with. It's larger than 4. And we've got some number of holes that we're dealing with. And the task is to figure out how rapidly can we take the complex space of possibility that is the union of our two specific complex spaces of possibility and collapse it down to the moment that is the highest quality event that this particular moment calls for. And that's, I think, in this conversation, but also I would say in general, like this is a very high thing for us to be getting better and better at doing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So when I messaged you, I did say that speaking about Civium could be a good idea.
Sure. It's very ripe.
Yeah. It provides a beautiful basis, I think, to begin to pull in other things and perhaps when ultimately lay the blocks down in the correct order. I think that's pretty much what it's about, in the knowledge that those blocks are to be replaced appropriately as well. So it seems like it would be a good thing to, ask you to introduce the notion of Civium to the kind of interested party that might not have heard you discuss it before, but is distinctly aware that we need to build differently. Things are changing. And it's the kind of person that likes to consider themselves, well, I'm ready for change, and I'm willing to, and actually I have the means to participate in some form. I'm willing to put in the time to understand. I'm interested in coming into a quality interaction, interested to participate.
So I'll give it a shot
in that, please.
So the way I think I maybe will begin is something like at the level of design, perhaps even just a bit of a critique. So we've endeavored, we meaning humanity, have endeavored, of course, many times to reinvent the way that we congregate, the way that we live together. And in the past several centuries have done so in ways that are endeavoring to do it in a way that is, I would say, conscious or intentional, right? Thoughtful. As opposed to merely functional, which was the order of the day for a long period of time. And what I would say is different about the notion of Civium is that the design intent came from the very beginning with a proposition that the problem that we're trying to deal with is, well, let me just begin by saying rather deep. And it's maybe the problem of civilization itself. So we're not just trying to figure out how to create sort of a nice place to live, for example, or even a place that is ecologically sound, because there's an awareness of the implications and complications of the total set of things that we do under the heading of civilization that need to be considered, and that the effort or the best intentions will tend to be unraveled or will fail, or sometimes even create negative consequences in a very micro case if you don't actually think about the global case as well. So that's maybe in the very beginnings. Is there a way to put your arms around it where the strength of your design is adequate to something that actually shifts the underlying basis of the deeper problem, which I'll just right now call the problem of civilization. In other language, I will call it the problem of game. And therefore is, at least in principle, able to address that set of problems effectively and create something which is enduring. Now, it's really interesting that in the past 6 months, I've been exposed to the work of one of your, somebody who lives near you, I think, actually, Tyson Yunkaporta, because he, coming from a rather different direction, ended up coming to some very similar conclusions, and I might be using some of his ideas. So the first is the proposition that, in fact, in many ways, the problem of civilization is also the problem of city. That it may, in fact, be appropriate to say that all civilizations are merely the sort of actuation adjunct of cities. And so whether you're talking about Roman Empire, or you're talking about the British Empire, or talking about the American Empire, or I suppose you can go backwards and talk about the city-states of Greece. In each case, the extended territory, as significant as it was, may in fact be properly seen as being something like the circulatory system of the city, which was at the essence of it. And the network of cities, by the way. And this is based, from my point of view, largely on the work of Geoffrey West and Louis Betancourt, which popularized in the book Scale. So that's a very, very interesting notion. And the next question would be, okay, why? And more specifically, what kinds of changes would be the adequate changes to shift that? And here again, Tyson, I think, hits the nail on the head when he makes a distinction between what he calls growth and increase. So here, the notion is that, well, again, West and Betancourt, they noticed that cities have a unique scaling characteristic, which is to say that as a city grows, certain metrics, like, say, for example, wealth per capita, grow in a very unusual way. Generally speaking, in nature, what we see is that when an organism, and that might include, say, like an ecosystem, like a forest, or a part of what we might consider an organism, like a cell, as the organism grows, most of the relevant characteristics grow on what's called a sublinear scaling. So what this means is, for example, if I take a mouse and I look at the rate of metabolism per unit mass, meaning how much energy is cycling through the organism for the total mass in grams, if I increase the mass, the actual metabolism only increases at about 85%. So if I double the mass, instead of the metabolism doubling, it only increases by 85%, which is to say that there's a certain efficiency built in, and also certain limitations to scale built in to biological organisms. And this is common across all living organisms, and in fact, common across human organisms as well. Like corporations have a similar scaling factor. If I double the number of employees in a company, I actually don't double the revenue per employee. It tends to increase. Decrease per employee. But cities behave differently. Betancourt and West discovered that they actually increase superlinear, which is to say, if I double the size of a city, and by the way, in some sense, hold everything else constant, I will actually get a 115% increase of the wealth per capita, or income per capita, if you prefer. Now, that's actually a super, super powerful discovery. And one of the characteristics, so now I'm kind of going off on my own, what's that called? I'm walking my own plank now. So what I would propose is that this makes the city a certain kind of a growth attractor. What the city has been trying to do throughout history, since we discovered the construct of the city, has been to grow, to put as many people as possible in the city as it can get. And sort of every problem context of cities, and therefore every problem context of civilizations that are attached to them, has to do with the constraints on that ability. So, for example, if I put, say, 1 million people in a city, I have to feed 1 million people. And if the only way that I can feed people is by hauling wheat in on people's shoulders in bags, I can't pull that off very easily. That's hard to do, more or less impossible. So I have to do things like invent roads or invent barges. Right? So there's a relationship between, on the one hand, the physical constraints that are associated with squeezing human bodies into physical space in terms of largely energy coming in and waste going out, but also what they need to do other things like meet other people and move around in the space, transportation and whatnot. The technological capacity of the environment that we're in, and then the limitations to scale that are possible, right? And so effectively every city is trying to solve that problem. And what Weston Betancourt found was that there was a moment where the city would tend to grow up to the limits of the existing technology. But remember, because as cities grow, the actual certain characteristics increase superlinearly. Well, one of those characteristics is actually innovation. So as the cities would grow in population, the innovation of that particular city, and therefore that civilization, would actually tend to also go superlinearly. So you get these explosions of innovation, which would tend to cluster around constraints to growth. And so you would tend to get these step functions where they'd actually pulse. And then, of course, you'd get things that were much, much larger than had previously existed in the world around them, like the first cities, Ur and Akkad and places like that. Until eventually they do peter out and something happens which limits their capacity to grow. Whoops, I lost you. Are we okay?
Yeah, keep going. I'm here.
So this sort of mammon desire to grow at all costs, and the kind of the imperial organization of all space, and to some extent all time, as a subsidiary function to feed the growth of the city, is a really interesting way of thinking about what's the problem of civilization. Everything ultimately becomes a feedstock. Every small town exists largely as a consequence of its context in the relationship to the capacity of it to serve as a way of feeding the growth of the city, all the way up the chain to the largest cities and ultimately, I guess, megalopolises and conurbations that are now dominate our landscape. Okay. So then what Tyson does is he presents an alternative, and here he specifically presents an alternative that was real in the context of the indigenous human groups, which he calls increase. And I love his metaphor, actually. He says, okay, if I want to increase or improve, let's just go with a very simple metric, IQ in a human. Broadly speaking, there's two things I might do. I could grow the number of neurons. I could just make it a larger brain. I could take a brain that weighs 10 kilograms and make it a brain that weighs 15 kilograms. Or I could increase the quality of the brain. I could increase not just the number of neural connections, the synapses inside, but also the quality, which ones specifically are networking with which ones, right? The network topology. And what I love about that metaphor is that it's real. Right? Human beings actually ran into a limit on how rapidly or how big we could get our brains because of the birth canal. And so we ran into that limit. Evolution was forced to find a way to continue to increase our cognitive capacities by virtue of increase, meaning if you think about development, these processes of development, the brain will actually create a huge number of connections, then prune the hell out of them, then increase again, all focusing on not more neurons, but on better connections. Okay, well, that's nice. That's a move, right? So the move is to say, okay, we need to find a way to move away from growth as a mandate and move towards increase as a mandate. So that's one key premise of Civium, right? First key premise is we need to find a way to move away from the city and all the characteristics that make the city the city. And the second is, all right, one of those characteristics is this notion of growth, and the thing that is the right thing is increase, quality of relationships specifically. And you can think about that quite practically. And if I'm moving into a city from a small town and I'm moving into a city of, say, 1 million people, how big is Melbourne?
I think about 3 million-ish, give or take a
Right.
million.
So I'm moving from a town of about a small city of 150,000, and I move to Melbourne. Part of the point, part of the attraction is there's just a much larger potential of relationships. There's the likelihood that I will be able to find people who are high quality relationships for me. They have similar tastes or interests or whatever. It's just a lot larger, right? By in this case, 2 orders of magnitude. Okay, that's true. But it also has a real problem, which is, well, there's 3 million fucking people. And the reality is you're only ever going to meet a small fraction of them, and only ever going to be in a relationship with an even smaller fraction. So beyond a certain small number, which is around 150,000 people or so, the bigger problem is actually search. It's not mass, right? You don't actually need, think about like the internet. The internet is vast. I don't need to have a bigger internet. What I need to have is a better way of finding the aspects of the internet that are relevant to me. And by the way, now. So that's another piece, right? When we start thinking about increase, we start thinking about quality. We start thinking about, oh, okay, well, the move is to say, how do I move away from just adding more nodes to the graph and move towards getting better and better and better at finding the right relationships? Okay, well, when I look at the right relationships, it seems there's 3 primary characteristics. One is who. So that's the easiest, right? Like right now, should I be talking to you right now, or should I be talking to someone else? The second is what, right? As we began the conversation, there's a very large number of possible things that we could have in our relationship, and being able to orient on that what quickly and well is a thing. And then in some sense, how, and how largely has to do with the skillfulness on both of our parts to enter into relationship, how deeply, fully, how intimately, how sustainably, how resiliently, how anti-fragile can we actually make the relationship itself. In some sense, that's that, right? So then we make another move. And I think that's probably, well, I'll stop for a moment. No,
Okay.
I'm going to break that promise. I've got things are pouring in from the back of my head right now. So the next move is an insight that I had recently, and I think it's right. So I'll put it out there. I've already put it in a video, but I'll put it here as well. One of the things that has been constraining the possibility of Civium up until very recently is the obligate binding of the virtual with the physical. So when I look at that superlinear scaling, and I look at it very closely, this notion of trying to squeeze as many bodies into the same space as possible, what I notice is that the thing that's really looking to be connected is not bodies, it's minds. The real thing that is actually driving growth is minds, more minds. Metcalfe's law specifically. It's communication is the governing protocol. And the reason why cities are cities is because up until very recently, the only way we could communicate was to be in person. And even still relatively until, like, I guess, COVID, the bandwidth of communication, right, interpersonal and embodied communication still radically dwarfed the bandwidth of telecommunication. But take the clock back 250 years, and it was obvious that if you wanted to communicate with other people, you had to be in the same room, more or less. So if communication between minds is the thing that wants to grow to all, right? It wants to be everyone, at least in potential. Okay, I get it. And so the city has been in kind of like dragging bodies along, trying to get minds into connection and having to deal with the fact these minds are connected to bodies. But nowadays, this is no longer, I don't think, a primary constraint, as we see in this call. You and I are not in the same room, and yet we're having a conversation, we're communicating. And it's not bad, right? It's not quite the same as being in the same room, but it's not bad. And I suspect on the one hand, we're getting better at it because we've been forced to by curfew and whatnot. And on the other hand, I think we can continue to get better at it with things like photorealistic immersive VR, for example, creating possibilities of increasing simulation of embodied experience. I'm going to put a flag there, by the way, because that, of course, can be a terrible thing. But we're now walking the razor's edge between terrible things and awesome things. I don't think there's a way for us to step forward without having both sides of the razor's edge in every step. So what we can do now is we can decouple the virtual from the physical. And we can render unto the virtual what is the virtual. And now, of course, be liberated to render unto the physical what is physical. And rediscover in the physical what Tyson's been talking about. Right? The more natural, humane, human scale ways of life that are in many ways indigenous. Having really high quality face-to-face interactions at the Dunbar level with other human beings, frankly, who we may spend large amounts of time with, real deep woven communitas. And by the way, with nature, really descaling these massively densified locations that separate us from nature and finding ways to live lightly with nature. And I'm going to flag that as well. This is non-trivial. Well, in fact, if we want to, we can double click on it because it's an interesting point of contention, to be frank. But then you've got a really powerful new combo, right? A situation where there's a virtual, and the virtual Civium is everything, right? So think of it as the thing beyond Facebook and hopefully radically better, right? Designed from the very beginning to actually be healthy. But where everyone, all minds, at least all those who choose to be there, can be. So it truly is a global community of minds. And that's it. Once you've hit that, there is no more to go. Right? All minds, at least in principle, have the possibility of being in connection with each other in a appropriately designed virtual. And then the flip side of the Civium is a global meshwork of holonically nested, so different levels of scale, but really focused on the lowest level of scale, on the level of neighborhoods and villages, of humans living in a very humane, human scale way. And I think I would sort of add a third piece to that, which is my experience, and I think there's good reason to believe this is a general experience, is that the projecting of self, projecting of mind into the virtual is quite taxing. A conversation of an hour in person, particularly a conversation of an hour in person, say in the forest, right, surrounded by nature, has a certain level of cost for me. I'm introverted. I think extroverts enjoy it.
I mean, yeah, I hear you. I mean, I definitely hear you on the increased cost. I think it has a lot to do with audience. The digital is definitely a thing. But I'm sure you've had experiences as well of speaking on stage, perhaps, or speaking to a crowd where, let's say, your voice wasn't that well received as being something which was quite taxing as well. At least
yeah, I agree with you. And there's like three elements to that conversation, or sorry, that experience. To be frank, makes me move to a toolkit that describes things like fields of energy.
Yeah.
And I've had experiences where I actually feel the energy of the group increasing my energy on stage. But then when I get off stage, I feel like I got unplugged from a light socket and I'm wrung out.
Mm-hmm.
I've had experiences where it's been kind of a fight. And there's been, and that also is quite draining. I've had a few experiences, but they're quite rare, where what you might say the spiritual or psychosocial practices of the group are actually highly nutritive. And so you walk away from the conversation with the group actually feeling refreshed.
Yeah.
This is harder to do in the digital, but that's the point. So what I would point to is something like new shamanic practices, new psychotechnologies that bring into the nature of the virtual with some thoughtfulness so that we are not depleted or not unduly depleted by our interactions in the virtual, and also can take advantage of the way that we can recharge ourselves so much more effectively when the physical is really designed to be nurturing.
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. So that's one big run. There's another big run that we can do if you'd like that speaks more to the Civium, just to the Civium from a different angle. But that's a good bite for now, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly would like. I am also conscious of time. So let me see if I can provide a couple things back here. Because man, there's a few different roads to go on here, a few different tributaries. So, I'm hearing a lot, and what I'm hearing is really good. I think I'm with you. Um, if I can put things into slightly different language, seems like, and it's going to be a bit quite abstract to begin with, but it seems like there's value to be found in gathering around or near the center, right? That the center matters to the periphery. If we take like the heart, right? There's blood moving all around the body. It's got to come back to it. I hear you when it comes, an analysis of city as being historically, at least, this movement of bringing minds together in relation, as enabling increased wealth and innovation by this percentage increase, coming, of course, at the expense of just broadly the infrastructure that enables whatever is around the center to, in fact, be nourished by what is, in fact, the whole. You know, so good. I mean, I did have a chat with a friend a little while ago. His name's Kieran, and he spoke to me about how, his understanding of why cities came into being as they did had to do with protecting in physical space a store of value, right? The store of banks, fundamentally. Now, I don't think that needs challenge the notion of what we're speaking about. I think we can see it as complementary, right? If we're protecting something of value around the center, whatever that thing is, there needs to be quite a precise formation of relationality, enabling of at least enough stability for the center to hold around that store of value, whatever it is, or that conception or sense of value.
Well, we can specifically point to the notion of stock, or the notion of store of value. There's a sort of a perturbation at the origin point of city, that one of the pieces is the separation of the human in complex flows and cycles into something that begins the process of extraction. And extraction is the movement that comes before store. I mean, you can't store anything of value until you've first extracted that value. And so it's, there's a cycle. There's a separation. There's extraction. There's store. Then, of course, in the context of store, there's a number of different things that happen, including protect.
Yep. 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 And well, it seems like unless we're breathing that value back and forth such that it is not extraction, but a right reciprocal relationship, we are fucked. That seems to be how it goes. Although we kind of fool ourselves because we don't live very long, and sometimes it takes a while to be fucked.
That's right. It can look real good.
Yeah.
If the short term, planning for the short term, if the short term is several hundred years, unfortunately, can be quite seductive to humans. It feels like the long term if you're planning, if your own personal planning horizon is shorter.
Yeah, and it's worth highlighting this as well, that I think the buy-in, which is probably the wrong terminology, to really grok and take seriously this whole domain of conversation requires, like, honestly and with deep humility, like really deep humility, because it's not an easy task, seeking to solve for, where solve is not the final solution, but is in some sense the right next step of relating to these grand problems of living together in such a way that endures, in a way that we've never done before, in a way that is so drastically beyond what the lifespan of, or in a way that opens itself to enabling so many more lifespans than just that of the individual. And is, of course, not only about human beings, but the entire ecology, as it has to be. Otherwise, you're not taking seriously this notion of breathing in and out, this reciprocal exchange of value. It just doesn't seem to work like that, right? I was watching a documentary about mushrooms, which was quite wonderful. Fantastic Fungi, I think it was called.
I've seen that.
Yeah, I mean, I just thoroughly recommend everyone check it out for just a visceral hit of nature presenting so many of the right patterns.
So what comes to me as you say that is a trade, and I think it's a very good trade. And to use Vervaeke's language, because he does such a great job of making it precise, it's a trait of relevance for salience. The extractive life at the end of the day is actually a salience life. Salience here, in some sense, representing the like cotton candy is super salient. It tastes really sweet, and if you lack a discerning tongue, you may think that it's super good and therefore attractive, and will choose to eat cotton candy over, well, I guess the archetype is broccoli. And if you have a short enough time horizon, which in this case is usually about 45 seconds, that might feel like a good trade. But if you're able to metabolize or feel the consequence of, oh, wait, now I feel terrible, I feel sick. And by the way, I only ate about 3 bites of this giant pile of cotton candy, you begin to realize that it's actually a bad trade. But the proposal I'd like to make is it's not broccoli we're talking about. It's meaningfulness, even the sacred. And I think that's the trade. The trade is the trade of the merely salient, what is in fact ultimately the superficial, for the truly meaningful, which is to say the sacred. And I think in this most profane age, that might be a trade that people can grasp easily, which is to say that once you've felt that trade, once you've actually noticed that it is possible to live life moment to moment in contact with the sacred and what that actually means and feels like, then that actually becomes a nice short-term trade. And you can just look at the thing on the left hand and the thing on the right hand and choose the thing on the right hand. You don't actually have to try to trade your short-term success for something which is kind of an imaginary long-term. You can trade your immediate relevance, your immediate sacred, your immediate meaningfulness, fulfillment, and well-being for your immediate superficial, your immediate super salient. I think that's a nice trade. I think that's one that is plausible. And I would actually, by the way, say that weaves into the second line of the Civium story, right? That trade, that shift, consciously done and deliberately done, which is to say, what I just said. We can actually look at it and think about it and get a sense at the level of things like cognitive science what we're talking about here with some precision, and then say, oh, okay, that makes sense. My heart and my mind can both say yes to this.
Yeah. The good flow. The good flow. I like that expression just in my own kind of, a kind of a lower resolution way in, but it's the, well, maybe like this. It might take us a while to get back to the completion of that thought, but we don't have all the time in the world. You speak about the value in linking minds together. And a few moments later, we're speaking about sacredness, and we're speaking about a right relationality of heart and mind, which is in fact the kind of, so perhaps it's worth, just for clarity's sake, speaking to these notions a little bit more. It doesn't seem to me there can be minds in relationship with each other absent, for a very long span of time, perhaps at all, absent a right relationality of bodies being in together. That might not mean we're necessarily right next to each other, right? But I'm doing something with mine over here, sitting comfortably on a chair, at least for now. And the mechanism, which is not the right way of speaking about, but the link between us, like why we care about this at all, like what is it we're caring and moving with, right? What is the flow that we can be part of, is not exactly just a flow of mind, right? It's a flow of something else. It's a flow of something that is constitutive of webbing, knitting together, is the being together of.
Yeah, nice. So can I say back to what I'm hearing? I think it's quite beautiful. I like it a lot. It'll take me, I think, a while to metabolize it completely. But in some sense, the premise of what you're saying is, hey, look, this thing that we've been calling communication, and perhaps communications channel and body, are kind of the same thing. So if I am speaking to you in person across a range of 4 or 5, 7 feet, I happen to be using air as the medium, but my body is connecting to your body. There's a touch. There has to be actual contact. And if I'm speaking to you across, well, I guess this is probably about 3,000 miles, pulling light into a camera, throwing the camera into a computer, throwing the computer up into a satellite, zipping it about and coming back down, I'm still touching you. The difference between the two is in some sense not existent. Our bodies are in relationship directly. We are as good as dancing. That's powerful. I think that's right, actually. That's very well put. And this speaks to, I think, I don't know. It's going to take me a while to integrate that.
Well, I think, it speaks in part to the gradualness of this process of coming into right relationship with the who's. With who? I'll say some more things about that, but it's like feeling what the right touch is in this new channel, in this new medium. It's a very interesting thing. I mean, how much of our interaction is mediated here by the voice and listening? How much is mediated by what I've been able to learn about body language that you can see given this percentage of my body, right? I mean, certainly some. So how much are we sort of bootstrapping on what we've learned in traditional physical space that we're porting over here versus what is possible in terms of efficiency of interaction and integrity of communication precisely within this channel itself? I mean, these are also things in development. And it's experiments with this kind of thing. Like I thought about perhaps, not for this conversation in particular, because it'd be almost too radical. It'd be almost too radical for me to be sitting down in that couch with like the camera presented a certain way, just like, cross-legged, like really relaxed back, like I would be if we were talking here. I'd be like, "Hey, Jordan, do you want to sit down?" Right? And I'd be lounging a bit, but I'm not lounging here. I'm forward, right? And that's respectful. I was talking with Tazi, my girlfriend, about this. It's respectful. I'm here. I'm ready, and we're doing something here. I want to create something beautiful with you, and I respect you, and so here I am. And yet, this is taxing because I'm in my living room, and I usually lounge over there. That's a lounge, right? So there's so many of these signals, so maybe we could port this over to something that I do think about quite a bit. And I think about when it comes to the question of what is it appropriate to record, i.e. kind of like when we speak about such things as sacredness, the very thing which we should be most careful about boxing up and pointing to and saying that is the thing right there, and forgetting ourselves always in relationship with it as the kind of constitutive generators of it, along with everything else in relationship, right? We come upon something, and it's like, we want to. It's water through a net, and so recording something is we have to be careful about it. But then, okay, I want to link this to something else. And it's the notion of hierarchy, and the notion of heterarchy, and also one of the sort of characteristics of Game B. So Game B, as I've heard you describe with Jimra on a few occasions, is characterized or aims at a kind of meta-stability, broadly speaking, to my understanding, a kind of endurance and a kind of anti-fragility, or at least resilience to perturbations and change, enabling of continuity of relationship and development. Network-centric or network-oriented, network-centric, is that what you say is one of the other characterizations?
That was an older formulation, but yeah.
Right, okay. And another one is non-hierarchical. Am I right with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting.
And just to add to that, it's not how to say it, like ideologically extinguish the notion of hierarchy, but rather specifically about shifting the hierarchical to be of service. There's a whole lot of this, like basically the unseating of something and moving into its proper location relationship. In many cases, the primary problems we're dealing with in game A is the tools becoming the masters, or addiction. We've become dependent upon our tools and have forgotten in many ways that they were tools in the first place, and have taken them as obligate. And so an unseating of that and a repositioning things into right relationship is a big part of it. So.
Good. Okay. Yeah, good. I mean, that resonates very strongly. It's perhaps not the clearest. It's perhaps not the clearest to say non-hierarchical, at least in terms of how it hits me, because it's
definitely not. People take it as meaning anarchic or flat, right?
Yeah.
The word non negates hierarchical.
So to complete then, what I'm seeing, at least the kind of the right way to hold a notion of hierarchy, and I'd love some feedback on this. I would try to see it more clearly, is something like more of a wave where you have natural peaks that give way to something more flat, and then to reestablish again, and that the peaks, hierarchical peaks, would be something like again, staying in a kind of metaphor space, but a kind of or one way to think about them. This is not the only way, certainly not, but it's a kind of ceremony where wisdom, learning, is actually conferred so that all reach that point. And so I started off by talking about recording, and I don't think I would be so mix and match here if we had a bit longer to speak. But there's something about the creation of artifacts and ceremony. There's something about events and ceremony which seems deeply important. It's this relationship between process and event. Alexander Bart's always speaking about this relationship between process and event. Been obviously very interested in process, and we're always engaging in events. But it's the kind of it's a feeling into an orchestration, a kind of a summoning. You've spoken about meshworks. Like, how is it that the waves then all of a sudden peak? Like, what are we gathering around? Bringing back in this notion of center, right? What are we gathering around?
Good. Yeah, the notion of center, I think, is exactly the place to go. Okay, so let's maybe invoke the notion of coherence and the notion of center. I'm not sure if values and purposes come in, but let's say there's a proper center, and by proper, what I mean is something like there's a distinct and high integrity shared sense of the what and the why in the context of some given event. Very concrete. The church is on fire in our town village. Okay, well, that's the center. Our collective intention. There needs to be no top-down pushing. There needs to be no formal structure. Our collective heads pivot in that direction. Our collective heart rates increase. Our collective eyes dilate. And then we begin the process in a space of coherence, meaning each and every are simultaneously oriented towards the same center. Something must be done. This feels very Deleuzian right now. It's not clear exactly what, but what must be done. The how is quite unknown, but the what and the why are. We need to put out the fire. We need to save the church. And the why is unspoken. It's a value, right? The values are held in in common. There's a common orientation, a common basis of values. So then we begin to shift from values to purposes. In the context of purposes, there is a right. It's as simple as that. There's a sort of a natural. I used to talk about it with Schmachtenberger as a natural hierarchy. There are some who are properly the most capable of organizing people into the right kind of structure to be able to address the problem at hand. It's unwise to put the 2-year-olds in charge of managing the bucket brigade. It is wise to put the ones who are stronger to carry the heavier water. I mean, it's not complicated if you sort of just deal with it.
Though if you were calling it the bucket brigade, I think you might actually, that might be the toddler version, to be honest. The church is burning, let's get the bucket brigade.
Not a lot of water is going to make it to the fire, I'm afraid. Having a 2-year-old and lots of buckets and lots of spilled water. But I think that's the key, right? Once you have a proper center, once there's been something where the values have oriented a group of individuals into what is in fact a coherent whole around what is now a shared purpose, then the right structure is just part of reality. And the right structure might be anything. It's hard to know exactly. And part of the real skillfulness is to orient ourselves into that right structure. But oftentimes it will have a division of labor. And that division of labor often will have different people taking different responsibilities. And in many cases, there will be a hierarchy because certain people will either be more skilled naturally or more skilled experientially. And therefore, it is appropriate for them to have more responsibility in the context of the nature of the purpose that is part of the shared group. One of the problems that I think we run into in our current context is that we don't have coherent groups. So we take what effectively are random strangers with quite distinct values and no shared purpose, and we force them to do stuff together. We force them to coordinate, and we create these weird truncating governance things like democracy, where it is very much taking that peg. It is nothing more or less than forcing round pegs into square holes. And it's because of the means and modalities of cosmopolitan cities have required the forcing together and the admixture of people into spaces that don't have the time or the space to find their coherence, and therefore has required that we build tools of coordination, tools of forcing random groups of people into being at least somewhat effective, and then imposing what then becomes formal hierarchy on the basis of that effective randomness. And therein lies the problem. Right? So we might say that's another distinction in the difference between city and civium, is this notion of proceeding from coherent wholes on the basis of some sort of shared values that then have a proper center as a whole. And then from that place, their movement into how is more a problem of competence than it is a problem of process, formal process. The process is organic. There's that. Now, you brought up the other one. How did it work? Well, what I was seeing there was I was seeing my friend Zach Stein and his emphasis on teacherly authority or on education. And it's funny because if you wanted to make fun of him, you could notice that he's sort of, it's easy to know that if he's sitting in a group, what he's going to bring into the conversation. The word education will definitely come up. But this is because it's a mess now and also is universally applicable. At all times, every relationship always has a educational content, right? That's how we do things. We're not just doing something, we're also growing our capacity in everything that we do. And that creates a nice, I think, how do I say it? Signpost or orientation on what this sense of coherence and the sense of proper center maybe feel like. If there's the right relationship of the process, if looked at through the lens of education, which is from my point of view the same as the lens of roughly the same as parenting, is you'll feel it. And if you feel the flow of education is there, and ideally maximally, if there really is a sense of, oh, I am growing as much as I can in the context of this encounter. I'm not just doing, I am growing. That actually is a really good way of knowing whether or not you're in the right relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd say we have about a minute more,
Yeah,
which
it's
is,
sad, but I guess it is what it is.
yeah, it is what it is.
And there's so much more to talk about.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think that around about 3 hours, 3.5 hours possibly feels right for me to get where it's possible to go in a way that would be very meaningful and I think deeply valuable. There's something about pacing. You know, Forrest speaks about the question of when as being a question of mysticism. The pacing of these interactions, I feel like in some ways I, playfully, I didn't violate anything, but I jumped at grabbing a few things to bring into the pot too quickly, and I could only really do that with you in this context because I know you can kind of go, all right, I was really throwing paint at the wall in some respects. But we can more gently make those brushstrokes.
Well, why don't we just make a commitment to having 2.5 more conversations?
Okay.
That's easy.
Okay, we can do that. Although the half might be challenging, but this was good. I think
what we do is we'll split it right down the middle. So instead of doing it this way, we'll do it this way.
Yeah, good. Well, I think there's in the first little bit there, a nice introduction to Civium. And for those people who are listening to this, there are, breadcrumbs to follow for ways to be involved in conversation now. That's something that, I'm facilitating with other people through this conversation and these kind of mutual learning environments, which Nora Bateson speaks about. But, this isn't something that, you have to put down and then be in complete discontinuity with. There is real opportunity. It's just people here that are open to having conversations. So yeah, look at the description and all the rest of it. And if you're interested, it's possible to speak. So yeah. All right, Jordan. Well, it's good to see you.
Good to see you
I hope
too.
you're very well.
Hopefully curfew wears itself out and you're able to go back outside and congregate. Good heavens.
Yeah. Well, I've been doing my best online. Yeah, the journey continues. That's for sure. All right, mate. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.